Good evening, everybody. First of all, I'd quickly like to just introduce the Public History Unit. We're an outreach programme that aims to bring history to a wider audience and engage people from all backgrounds. Should the fire alarm sound, fire safety, please use these two lower doors to exit and congregate by the graveyard. I'd really like to welcome Dr Sue Onslow this evening, who is the Senior Lecturer and Deputy Director at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. She's also a teaching fellow at King's College London and has taught at London School of Economics as well. A leading oral history practitioner, her main areas of research are British foreign policy and decolonisation, Southern Africa, particularly South Africa and Zimbabwe, and the Commonwealth. She's published extensively on Southern Africa in the Cold War period. Articles include The Man on the Spot, Christopher Soames and the Independence of Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, from the British Scholar. She's contributed to books such as The Interrogation in War and Conflict, A Comparative and Interdisciplinary Analysis, and Dr Sue Onslow was also the co-editor of Southern Africa in the Cold War post-1974, and in April this year is releasing a book entitled Robert Mugabe as part of the Ohio Short Histories of Africa series on the screen. This lecture, hopefully, will cover the fall of Mugabe's regime and its consequences in Zimbabwe. So please warmly welcome Dr Sue Onslow. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that very warm welcome, and thank you very much for the opportunity to puff up my book. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is. This was a work in progress for about a year, and I had just pressed send of the manuscript to the publisher when my co-author, Martin Plaut, who is a former BBC World journalist who was Africa editor for a number of years, phoned me up and said, "Comrade, you'll never guess what's happened." And I said, "There's been a bloody coup." And he said, yes, there has. And of course, that meant that we would have to rewrite the end. For the next week, Martin and I followed the news from Southern Africa, particularly, of course, focusing on the extraordinary theatrics around the army's move against Mugabe, then Mugabe's refusal to step down, then the complicated power play that, of multiple forces that seemed to be pressing upon him. I mean, to me, this was thoroughly Shakespearean. This was the barons who'd stepped in to remove an overmighty courtier, Grace Mugabe, in the interests of the aging king. I mean, Shakespeare really would have had a lot of fun with actually what was going on in Harare in that intense week. And then there was the final acceptance, the short resignation speech, and that meant that Martin and I, who had been sucked into the making of news around the event, could actually settle down and rewrite our end, and that's what is then included in this book. So we were both, should we say, Martin as a South African brings to it a particularly journalistic, deep knowledge of events in Southern Africa and following Zimbabwe for probably about 30 years. I came to it from an academic perspective. I've written on the Cold War in Southern Africa, the complicated history of Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, on liberation politics. So I was coming at it, as I say, from a different angle. And we've divided up this particular book. I've written the earlier period. He's taken it from 1980 up to probably 2013, and then together we wrote about Mugabe's, I hesitate to use the word demise, but his political demise, and then pointing forward the epilogue. What does it, a short epilogue, what does this then mean for Zimbabwe? And all I can say is, for those of you, if ever you're asked to do any media training, do it. Snap it up, because it was fascinating to be involved as a cog in the news machine that was, if you like, the international news story around Robert Mugabe's fall. So then the book published by Ohio University Press, it's not a monograph, as I've said. It's aimed at a generalist audience. It's aimed at undergraduates as an accessible starting point, if you like, for the history of a complicated politician. And I want to emphasize this, the complexity of Mugabe. It's too easy to slide into simple demonization of this long-standing leader of Zimbabwe. A complicated man, a complicated politician, the past master of political manipulation, and his adept ability to maneuver between warring factions and to position himself as the solution. But ultimately age caught up with him, and his very longevity was proving to be so complicated for the roiling mass that was ZANU-PF from 2013 until last November, and of course the future of his country. Because I have to say, Mugabe stayed too long in power, and that is the tragedy of the man. I also think that he suffered from a sad case of the I'm indispensables. Now, this could be said to be a pattern of power and leadership, because this is a study in leadership, of a very able man, a brilliant mind, who came to believe in the inadequacy of those that surrounded him. Through the practices of power, he came to be surrounded by coteries who had their own vested interests in keeping him there, but he too was reliant upon them, but he was disdainful of their intellectual capabilities. He felt they were a disappointment. And if you come to believe that, you can then convince yourself through a very useful, self-serving, justificatory narrative to yourself, look who I'm surrounded by, my country needs me. I can't step down and hand it to these people. Goodness knows what they will do. So that invidious process then that erodes, should we say, a smoother transition of power, this crisis of transition for Zimbabwe has been a long time in the making. And ZANU-PF has now resolved it through, shall we say, a seeming smooth transition. But make no mistake, this was a coup. This was a coup. But it could not be admitted as a coup precisely because of the wider ramifications for Southern Africa and within the African Union. So I'm going to be talking about the man. I'm going to be talking about the way in which those around him manipulated the situation and used power as a political lever to oust him, to really winkle him out of State House, and then to talk a little bit about his successor and what this means for present-day Zimbabwe. So I also want to underline right at the start that we in the West have an excessive predilection, I think, to emphasizing the role of the individual. And we need to understand that in understanding Zimbabwe's current politics, that structure is also important. And these are structures that we don't necessarily understand from our own political cultures. Because in Zimbabwe, it is a unique case, although these patterns do occur elsewhere, but Zimbabwe displays it to a particular degree, of the relationship of a national liberation movement that has moved apart a political party of power that enjoys a particular relationship with the armed forces. In Zimbabwe's case, the Zimbabwe Defense Force represents the military wing of the party. Or it could be said another way, the party represents the political wing of the army. And if you understand that, then when there has been a crisis, or ZANU-PF, the ruling party in Zimbabwe, since 1980, the elections of February, March 1980, when they have been under pressure, when they have reached points of crisis, the army has stepped in and basically saved their bacon. And this has happened in 1999-2000 over the dispute, over the referendum over the draft constitution. It happened again in the disputed elections of 2002, when the security services started to roil out violence to intimidate and to corral and control and to deliver the appropriate electoral outcome. And again, it happened in 2007. So the army then has been a political lever and has seen itself as a regulator of the state, very much, if you understand, the way that the army as a political institution in the structures of the state is, say, in the Turkish context or the Egyptian context. It is not as we understand it in our constitutional practice of separation of powers, of the army as an apolitical, non-partisan element that is divorced from politics, even if its elite may hold political views and say, yes, we can do this to the politicians. The argument is, should we do it? Okay? So it's very important to bear that in mind. So the contenders, the infighting in ZANU-PF about who was to succeed Mugabe really kicked off after the 2013 elections. These were, for many outsiders, seen as a surprising result. a surprising victory by ZANU-PF. There was a belief that these again had been stolen, but there had been a failure to understand the recalibration of class relations that had taken place in Zimbabwe between, say, 2000 and 2013, directly associated with the land transformation program. And also, although many outsiders refused to believe it, and certainly the Western press corps, particularly in this country, refused to accept, Mugabe did have a residue of popularity among sections of the Zimbabwe political electorate, and ZANU-PF's core constituency remains in the rural areas. Anyway, I'm sure that the vote was manipulated to a degree, but I also believe that ZANU-PF won. They didn't need to manipulate it to the extent that they did, but they won. And critically, in the presidential election, which was held at the same time as parliamentary elections, Robert Mugabe won the presidential vote, I think by 1.3 million people. Okay? So in other words, he believed himself to be the people's choice, not simply his party. So he's leader of the party, and as I say, it's anointed presidential candidate and successful candidate. The contenders. I'm going to talk about the political persona of his wife, Grace Mugabe. She, in a way, was a tabloid's dream. A very controversial and flamboyant figure who grew into the role. As you can see here, she decided to rebrand her husband's image. This image is taken from some of the star rallies. He decided that he was going to circumvent the political shenanigans that were going on within ZANU-PF, and they were going to take the message to the people. And they inaugurated a series of rallies that were conducted throughout the country. And I have Zimbabwean friends who say, Sue, they were mesmerizing, absolutely mesmerizing. They were huge rallies. Mugabe was an accomplished orator with an ability to use words that enabled him to reach out to people. And this has actually been acknowledged now that he's stepped down. People saying, I never thought I would miss his voice. But he had become so embedded, if you like, in the role of leadership and the voice of leadership, having been a leader for 37 years. Now, Grace Mugabe at these rallies was unbound, if you like. She was, her language was not controlled. She didn't pull her punches in criticizing people whom she deemed to be her husband's enemies. She also could be foul-mouthed, use of invective, accusations that could be of sorcery. In other words, she was really unstable ordnance for many in ZANU-PF. But she became a lightning rod. In some ways, she became a scapegoat for problems in Zimbabwe. She also challenged social ideas in a conservative society of what was appropriate political behavior of the the political leader. So she was a challenge at multiple levels. Grace Mugabe also has been extraordinarily acquisitive. Extraordinarily so. She has nicknames such as Gucci Grace for her predilection for designer clothes. I believe, I've been told on reasonable authority, that her overdraft facility was $30,000 a day. Yeah, that's quite expensive. She also was known as Amazing Grace because she was awarded at a mere 3 months registration a PhD at the Department of Sociology at the University of Zimbabwe. There was the rather extraordinary scenario of Robert Mugabe, who was Vice Chancellor of the University of Zimbabwe, awarding his wife a PhD on the same occasion as her arch rival Joyce Mujuru was also being awarded her PhD. Now, there was absolutely no doubt that Joyce Mujuru deserved hers. Grace Mugabe's PhD was lodged in the university library some time after its award, and it was realized that actually in there were sources of research that had been done after the award of the degree. So, as I say, that was a political award. Anyway, Grace Mugabe, in other words, had her enemies. And she also realized quite how much she was disliked, indeed loathed among certain sections of the population. However, she did form, she would say, a political alliance with younger members within ZANU-PF, referred to as Generation 40, G40. A younger section of the political elite who felt that it was time, after all, for a political change. Their time had come. And they were challenging if you like, a representative of the old guard in Emmerson Mnangagwa, another, should we say, veteran liberation fighter, and who had extraordinary connections within the army, that element of the security services. He was his claim to fame was as leader of the Crocodile Commando. He had been sent to China for training and came back in, and as part of a small group, infiltrated Zimbabwe, or as it was then, Rhodesia, from Zambia, and launched an attack on a Rhodesian white farmer. And Mnangagwa, in the myth of Zanla, the military wing of ZANU at that time, he said he killed the farmer single-handed. He stabbed him. Now that gave him kudos among liberation fighters. He was in jail for 10 years and on release joined Robert Mugabe in Mozambique and positioned himself as very much his right-hand man, his supporter, his protector, his enforcer. As the minister responsible for intelligence, he was implicated in the violence in Matabeleland against Matabele communities between 1983 and 1987. Now, I'm mentioning this because this is important in present-day Zimbabwe, in its politics and the processes of reconciliation. In the killings that took place in Matabeleland, that were a complicated amalgam of dissident liberation fighters from a rival liberation army, political dissenters, a degree of aggrieved returning refugees, but also violence visited by the North Korean trained 5th Brigade, accountable to the president, against the wider population, precisely to teach it a brutal political lesson. And in the killings, the massacres, the rapes, the mutilations that took place down there, the disappeareds, no one knows quite how many people died. I've read statistics of 20 to 30,000. I interviewed one member of the Central Intelligence Organization, Dan Stannard, who worked with Mnangagwa, and he said he believed the figures to be as high as 50,000. And he went on the record to say that. No one knows. Now that is a huge psychological scar for that particular community in southern Zimbabwe. So Mnangagwa has a complicated past. He served in cabinet. He lost his seat in 2000 and owed his return to Robert Mugabe. He, for a very brief period, served as finance minister, justice minister. In other words, he is implicated, if you like, in the Robert Mugabe era. And he was positioning himself, as Robert Mugabe was increasingly absent. He was known as president of the skies for some time because of his pattern of always being out of Zimbabwe. Actually, that was a means whereby his, should we say, his coterie could draw large per diems upon the Zimbabwe exchequer. So yet another form of insidious corruption. But Mnangagwa was, shall I say, increasingly in a power struggle with Generation 40, G40. Now, it reached a crisis point, I would say, by late September, early October, when relations had become so bad, when Robert Mugabe and Grace Mugabe particularly had criticized Mnangagwa openly from the platform of one of the star rallies, that increasingly he seemed to be, quote, a marked man. Now, General Constantino Chiwenga, who is currently the vice president, he was a former professional soldier and was one of the key allies of Emmerson Mnangagwa. Now, a Zimbabwean patriot, a professional soldier, who also, should we say, was increasingly at odds with Mugabe. And there have been published by Reuters Central Intelligence Organization reports that that Mugabe feared that there could be a coup launched against him. Now, I've read some reports, I haven't seen them substantiated, but some reports that Mugabe was so concerned that there was going to be a coup that he made exploratory soundings to Israeli sources for possible arms and possible security force support, and possibly also to Russia. Now, as I say, those are unsubstantiated reports. But in other words, this gives you an indication of how fraught the political environment was within ZANU-PF and the relationship with the key leader of the army. Okay? So Chiwenga, in fact, as I say, was increasingly at odds with Mugabe before he went on a prearranged trip to China. And in China, it's believed, again, I'm referring to the Reuters report. Reuters drew upon extensive interviews and leaked CIO sources from both Beijing, Moscow, and also reporting from South Africa and Zimbabwe. And it is reported that when he was in China, that Chiwenga expressly asked Chinese officials, if we launch a Guardian coup, in other words, to correct the political crisis, the domestic, which is roiling up inside Zimbabwe, would China intervene? Now, this is enormously important, of course, because China is the lender of last resort for the beleaguered Zimbabwean economy. It has a massive debt arrears of over 1.2 billion, and there is the whole question of it needs to service its short-term debt as well as address its long-term debt obligations, but also China is the principal investor, external investor in the Zimbabwean economy. And apparently, Chiwenga was led to believe that China would regard this as a domestic issue within inside Zimbabwe and it would not take a public stance and criticize. Chiwenga, on his return, there were attempts to arrest him, but his allies within the army managed to ensure that he was not arrested. There are tales of people dressing up in baggage handlers' uniforms at the airport and making sure that he was not arrested and he was able to come back in. But he made a very public statement on his return saying that, on the crisis of that was clearly boiling up in Zimbabwe following Emmerson Mnangagwa's sacking, because he'd been sacked as vice president, and the army was taking a public political position in open forum. When Emmerson Mnangagwa was sacked as vice president, he fled because he had been warned that he was a marked man, as I've said, and he feared for his life. And I think with reason, because there is a long list of Mugabe's political opponents who have died in mysterious circumstances. He fled to the Mozambique border, there was a brief scuffle, and by his own account, he got into Mozambique and he walked through a minefield, was able to get to Maputo, and then maybe he went to China, but he certainly was in transit to South Africa. Now, there's very much a masculine narrative that accompanies Emmerson Mnangagwa's recital of what happened, and I think this is highly conscious, and it's also part of reinvigorating, if you like, the image of Zimbabwe, that Zimbabwe had suffered from an image of being the basket case of Africa. It was going down the pan under an aging leader. It was debilitated, renewed economic crisis. Emmerson Mnangagwa has consciously sought to emphasize robust re-engagement, that he is a man in his 70s. In other words, he is the man for the job, and Zimbabwe is reinvigorated. The idea of Zimbabwe has moved on from the debilitating era, but he is picking up and building upon the legacy of Robert Mugabe, emphasizing the best of it. Now, the coup itself, of course, was followed avidly on social media. I made reference to Martin and I conferring on the telephone and saying there's been a coup. We immediately, of course, dived onto the internet to see what was coming up and what was flipping up on social media. And my good friend, Violet Gondo, who is a dissident journalist who based in this country because they had taken away her Zimbabwean passport and banned her from returning. Her tweet was, "Welcome to the campaign trail, ZDF, Zimbabwe Defence Force, what kept you?" Which was a very astute remark because the army was acutely concerned what was going to happen in the elections that have to be held by August of this year. So this was a blatant political intervention, if it was indeed a coup, because we weren't sure at that particular time. That night, it now transpires that Chiwenga had launched Operation Restore Legacy. And that was on the Sunday, and they implemented it. These events were all happening then on the Tuesday night. Yes, I think I have to say I didn't sleep much that week, so the events did start to come rather a blur, so please excuse me if I haven't got my dates absolutely pinpointed. Chiwenga had launched Operation Restore Legacy. This was a carefully calibrated coup. We believe that they had put together over the previous 2 years. It was highly targeted and delivered with military efficiency. They took over State House. They took over, as the first rule of launching any coup is, you take out the television station, you make sure that you command the newsscape. And so staff at ZBC were swept off air, and Major General F.B. Moyo, who I'm going to show you a picture of in a rather tight uniform, came on and announced that this was action against the criminal cabal, the criminal elements. It was most certainly not a coup. They also surrounded Robert Mugabe at his residence in Borodale West, known as Blue Roof. Now, apparently when they had wind that a coup was in action, and apparently, again, according to the Reuters report, Grace Mugabe immediately phoned a minister, probably the Minister of Information, although it might have been the CIO, to say, we need to shut down social media. So in other words, her instruction was shut down Twitter, shut down Facebook, but for whatever reason, that did not happen. Anyway, Mugabe was indeed taken into military custody, and I believe that Grace Mugabe was separated from him. Again, I'm going to make some reference to social media in a minute. So this was delivered with military precision. Now, it was presented very much as a bloodless event, that it was carried out with military efficiency, with clinical and judgment, and the criminal elements were, quote, swept up, and so that the army was in control. Now, in fact, I've been told on reliable sources that at least 10 people were killed that night. They were killed either they were loyal elements to Mugabe that were racing to Blue Roof to protect him, that were shot en route. There were members of the CIO that were taken into custody and that were tortured and killed. So this is not quite the bloodless, non-coup narrative that, should we say, the present dispensation would say. But, you know, more and more, we're finding out more and more. So SB Moyo going on television and saying this is not a coup. But, I mean, I refer to this as the Zimbabwe Duck, because if it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, and it's got feathers like a duck, then it probably is a duck. This is, after all, a gentleman in military fatigues who is coming on air, having bundled, should we say, the normal presenter off air. And there are sounds of explosions going off around Harare, which is quite a small town. And you'd make you think, something's up. But anyway, this is the non-coup. Okay, this is where social media, Zimbabweans who've got a fantastic sense of humor, really had some fun. Because, I mean, I can't tell you the memes that were going around. This, I think, is one of my favorites. It is, of course, Grace Mugabe, because nobody knew where she was. Was she in Namibia? She couldn't go down to South Africa because of the incident of claiming diplomatic immunity because of an assault on a poor South African model when her sons had got into, should we say, a spot of bother about wrecking a flat in Sandton. Anyway, so this was, you know, was she then running down the runway, towing her suitcase of designer clothes after her? This was Zimbabwe, closed for renovation, because there was an official news blackout. No one really quite knew what was going on. The Herald, which is a state-owned print media, which has got an online presence, was not reporting on what was going on, so Zimbabweans, being resourceful, were contacting anybody who might have an idea. This is a South African manufacturing brand, and I love this. You know, was Mugabe going to spill the beans? But anyway, it's called Coup. So, yeah, they were having a lot of fun. Anyway, the problem for those who were seeking to encourage Robert Mugabe to step down ran into a spot of bother in that he refused to do so. Because, in his view, he was constitutional head of state, and this was an unconstitutional action. So then there was the gripping theatre of those days when it was evident that all was not going according to the military leadership's plan. And there were pictures of him greeting General Chiwenga very civilly at State House, pictures of visiting South African emissaries sitting around, with Robert Mugabe sitting very much in the chair, in command. It was a photograph that told you an awful lot. Then there was the spectacle of him going to a University of Zimbabwe graduation ceremony. Martin phoned me and said, "They've let him out, what's going on?" And I said, well, they obviously didn't stop the sandwiches with the mediators. Actually, what was happening was that there were intense mediation going on between those who were sleeping at King George VI barracks, now called Josiah Tongagara barracks, and they were shuttling backwards and forwards, trying to broker the way in which Robert Mugabe would agree to step down. Was this going to be straight away, or was it going to be at the Special Party Congress, which had been convened for the December? At which it had been expected that Grace Mugabe, might be confirmed as vice president. She was certainly closely involved in its organization and the committee organizing ZANU-PF's contribution to, run up to this year's elections. Then one of the key political actors, Chris Muchangwa, who, head of the war veterans, decided that I'm simplifying this, but it was decided that the way to demonstrate to Mugabe that it was genuinely the people's wish that he should step down, that he should rest. So on the Saturday, there were the extraordinary spectacles of ZANU-PF supporters coming out on the streets and saying, Robert Mugabe needs to step down, we respect him, but it is time, he is an old man, he needs to rest. Opposition from MDC who were on the streets with their narrative of Mugabe must go. But at this particular point, it could be said that the opposition was actually serving ZANU-PF's interests because they were sliding into the same narrative. But it also risked, for those that had launched the Guardian coup, a potential democratizing coup. Because what if the soldiers were there, the police were off the streets, what if these crowds got out of hand? What if, okay, it wasn't simply, they were allowed to assemble around State House, but they were determined to be kept away from Borrowdale West, from Blue Roof. Because what if a scenario developed where there was violence? What if they tried to storm the residence? You would then have the army, who were being hugged and congratulated as being Zimbabwean patriots. They risked then firing on other Zimbabwean patriots. It could have spiraled out of control. And I've read reports of those who said, we feared a Gaddafi moment. Now that's a very powerful phrase, because we all remember what happened to Gaddafi. So it was an extraordinary energy and euphoria on the streets of Harare that day, mass demonstrations, a lot of drunk, happy soldiers, in fact, too. Also, there were demonstrations in Bulawayo. Then, of course, you have the whole question of the non-resignation speech. Did any of you watch it? Okay, all right. Okay, I'm a coup geek. I accept that. There was the spectacle after Robert Mugabe had been he'd been demoted, redeployed, as leader of ZANU-PF. His wife had been unceremoniously kicked out of the party structures for good, and she'd also been kicked out as head of the influential ZANU-PF Women's League, as had 19 of her G40 members at national and also provincial level. Then there was this spectacle, very heavily trailed by those who expected him to step down and in the international media, where Robert Mugabe, who had written this speech and had not shared it with the military leadership, was on a platform surrounded by the military hierarchy, who all treated him with immense respect. Sitting next to him was his long-term advisor, the Catholic priest, Father Fidelis Mukonori. And I was thinking, is he going to deliver the last rites on Mugabe's political career as I'm watching this? And this was a 20-minute speech in which he said that this was a constitutional, this had not been a constitutional coup, this had not been a blow against the Zimbabwe constitution. They had acted within the realms of what was permissible. In other words, the crisis had been brought to his attention. He appreciated their patriotism. In other words, he validated what had happened and said that and pointed towards the party congress in December. Now, that to me implied that Robert Mugabe, the arch political manipulator of playing factions off against each other, may have done a deal with the army hierarchy, that he could stay on and he would step down at a time of his choosing and would certainly, according to ZANU-PF procedures, he would only do this at the party congress, the special party congress in December. In other words, a gap opened up between the politicians and also the war veterans who wanted him to step down as soon as possible because they could see what this threatened for accelerating economic meltdown. And Robert Mugabe, a very stubborn man for whom resignation was not part of his vocabulary. But then, it really did give the Zimbabweans who were following this avidly on television almost a national heart attack. And you can see here the look of frank disbelief on those. This is filmed in one of the shopping precincts in central Harare. So then what? Chris Muchangwa said that the Central Committee had demanded that he resign or impeachment proceedings would be initiated on the Monday. The deadline came and went, so I'm just going to go back to that. And so Parliament initiated impeachment proceedings. Now, this is important because the Zimbabwe Constitution at the moment does not have a clause allowing for the recall of the president. The president could be replaced if he became physically or mentally debilitated, and in the judgment of his doctors that he was obliged to step down. In other words, there were careful procedures, but they couldn't recall him. They could only impeach him for abuse of office. So this is when extremely sharp members of the MDC opposition realized that their point had come to try to press for security sector reform, for a potential coalition government, and that there should be an acceptance of free and fair elections and also an accelerated investment in changing the electoral roll. Very, very important. But those in ZANU-PF realized that they were to launch impeachment proceedings. It would then move to a committee drawn from representatives across the parliament, and there would be 9 members of it. And if the opposition had genuinely toughed it out and said, we will not agree to impeach him unless you agree to our demands, ZANU-PF wanted this to be resolved in 2 to 3 days. They confidently announced that this was possible. To the opposition, this was, as I say, their pressure point and their chance. So, at this point, with Mnangagwa announcing that Robert Mugabe should resign or be humiliated, then the pressures became too much for him. And he, through a short letter that was written and delivered to the Speaker of the House, which was read out at the Zimbabwe this conference centre, which is next to the Parliament. The reason that they moved there is that Parliament physically wasn't big enough because of the increase in the number of seats. So that's why they moved to the conference centre. Anyway, you have scenes of jubilation that were there. And there was the most fantastic all-night party across Harare and also in Bulawayo. Now, I'm not sure, and I've been told that the news of Mugabe's resignation took some considerable time to filter out into the rural areas because there is quite an urban-rural divide in present-day Zimbabwe. Not simply in terms of socioeconomics, but also in terms of access to information and access to news, because their community radio is particularly important. Right, so with Mugabe's resignation, Emmerson Mnangagwa returned and was inaugurated as president, the smiling crocodile. So the debate is then around in this political transition in Southern Africa. Mugabe did not have to step down, just as President Jacob Zuma, whose resignation was a Valentine's Day present to South Africans, it has to be said. Zuma did not have to step down either, but shall we say, irresistible pressures combined to oblige them to present their resignation. Mugabe was convinced that he remained the people's choice, and he remains convinced that there was a coup against him, that he was determined to go at a time of his own choosing. It genuinely is the end of an era for Zimbabwe. He was the longest surviving liberation leader. Mugabe has just had his 94th birthday. He had been in power since independence in 17th of April 1980. So for generations of Zimbabweans, they have only known one leader. So there was a real sense of an end of an era. The rhetoric of sanctions, external sanctions, be they EU or be they American, being the cause of Zimbabwe's economic plight. That rhetoric has been dramatically toned down. The accusation of enemies and the imperialists who all have designs upon independent Zimbabwe similarly has been swept away. Mnangagwa is adopting very much the rhetoric of robust re-engagement with the international community. He was at Davos, certainly on a charm offensive. I can't remember the last time that a leader of Southern Africa quite so determinedly secured an interview with the Financial Times, on an extended interview on the Saturday edition, 3 days before he was to go to the World Economic Forum. So, but is it really that much of a change? I would argue no. That the coup was entitled, as I said, Operation Restore Legacy. Now, whose legacy? As I've indicated, Mnangagwa has been personally and politically implicated in, if you like, in the history of ZANU-PF and its coteries and power structures since independence. He was Mugabe's enforcer. So he is a man with a complicated political past. He has announced that there should be should we say, reconciliation and a moving forward, that there should be a forgive and forget. This is problematic because of the issue of violence against political dissidents and, if you like, the real psychological trauma, the violence in Matabeleland, which remains a very hot political potato in present-day Zimbabwe. There is a political party, very small, that is demanding for separation of Matabeleland, that are politicizing, if you like, the history of Kukuruhundi. But it remains a very real, lived issue which has not been addressed. There has been no public apology and acceptance of responsibility, and the perpetrators of violence have not been brought to justice. Now, these debates about then reconciliation and moving forward are very much current across Southern Africa, with those who argue in neighbouring South Africa that Truth and Reconciliation Commission might have been framed around giving the victims a voice. But there was, of course, an amnesty that accompanied that. There were not prosecutions. So these debates then are important political, philosophical, and social cohesion debates about how, if there are instances and practices of violence, how do communities come to terms with this? How do you then atone, and how can you build open, tolerant society, which are necessary elements for democracy? These are very, very important debates in terms of social and national cohesion. Because Zimbabweans realize that there is a deeply traumatized political community, a deeply traumatized social community, and this is intergenerational. There has been a politicization of youth and, if you like, an empowerment through the use of violence. There has also been the very, very real violence and traumas of the liberation struggle, which I don't believe have been adequately addressed. There has also been the violence associated with ZANU-PF's authoritarian rule. Those very structures are the authoritarian constitutionalism that is the ZANU-PF state, because it is a ZANUification of the state, have evolved into very different practices which have led to civil and human rights abuses. And yet Zimbabwe has, in some ways, the trappings of a modern democracy that we would recognize, should we say, from Europe, in having elections. There is a Zimbabwean Electoral Commission. These are multi-party, they are contested. There are legal frameworks. There is a very battered but still functioning judicial system. It does have a functioning bureaucracy. So there are forms and norms that are there in Zimbabwe, but you have this multiple layers of authoritarianism, of violent practice, and you also have social ruptures that are both horizontal and are also vertical. So this is a particular study in political transition in Southern Africa. There are unique historical legacies that have fed into the events of last November, both in the long term and also in the short term, which continue to play out. What does this then mean for Zimbabwe's future? There are those who adopt a very much more positive attitude and saying that Zimbabweans are a very literate. By the early 1990s, Zimbabwe had the highest level of literacy across Southern Africa. That was one of Mugabe's, a former teacher, one of his very positive legacies. And high degrees of education, value attached to education, a entrepreneurial diaspora who remain committed and have supported ordinary Zimbabweans through times of real crisis. And there are strategies of engagement with that diaspora, not simply in terms of money flows, but also drawing upon their entrepreneurial capacity. There is an international willingness to assist and move forward. Britain is particularly determined to try to overcome the toxic relationship that developed between London and Harare during the Mugabe years. And there is seemingly an attempt to accelerate Zimbabwe's return to the Commonwealth because of an imprimatur of respectability in this multilateral association that comes with that, and also appealing to a wider community of best practice, because it, again, helps to detoxify that former colonial relationship. But there are enormous problems that confront even those who say, look, the future is bright for Zimbabwe, it has enormous potential, because of the cash crisis, because of spiraling inflation, because of the very real economic issues associated with capital flight and disinvestment. Mnangagwa knows that he has a very short time before ZANU-PF is obliged to go to the polls. And this was very evident in his instruction to ministries that they had 100 days to achieve key results. Well, that's very difficult in terms of foreign policy. But Mnangagwa, it seems to me, and his cabinet are using foreign policy as a means to sustain regime change and the regime. So it is not, we tend to think of foreign policy as operating outwards, but in this case, foreign policy directly has implications for regime stability, for external lines of diplomatic and financial support, and also implying a degree of solidarity. And this point of solidarity, because what happened in Zimbabwe really challenged the structures, processes, and declared agenda of the Southern African defense community and its organs to ensure protection of institutions of democracy, and also the African Union. That is why it could not be acknowledged as a coup, precisely because that is proscribed in the African Union Charter, and it is also, it would require elements of sanction by the Southern African defense community, development community. So, again, for Zimbabwe going forward, a complicated picture with potential but enormous obstacles en route. A re-energized hope for a better future, which is always necessary, but the reality of acute socioeconomic problems, and also how very hard life is for Zimbabweans in the day-to-day. I met that when I was down in Zimbabwe in January. I wanted to go down as a historian because I felt this is an extraordinary time of change. I wanted to see it because I commentated from far. I wanted to go and see it. And I was very aware of how fragile the situation there was. The sense of seeming hope and stability moving forward, but the very real potential for civil conflict and social unrest that operated under the surface, the very real frustrations of day-to-day living. And that was seen in an instance of road rage that I was involved with. And I thought, wow, that was a flashpoint that I hadn't expected. But it just typified the level of frustration of day-to-day living. But again, it was almost a schizophrenic encounter that I had, because there was seeming social ease, but also a watchfulness and awareness that things could kick off in the blink of an eye. It was a very, very interesting encounter. I personally think that this window that has opened up of a great, a seeming more peaceful dispensation of a new climate of political rhetoric, which has allowed Morgan Tsvangirai, who's just died, the veteran head of MDC, to be acknowledged by ZANU-PF as a patriot. Now, there hasn't been a political culture which has accepted the idea of a loyal opposition in Zimbabwe. But again, it's trying to draw him into their narrative. So the rhetoric is strong, but actually the underlying problems are very, very real for Zimbabwe, and I don't see a quick fix, I must say, going forward. But that isn't to say that it's a basket case, far from it. Just in the same way, Robert Mugabe was not a monster, and we shouldn't slide into simplistic demonization of this liberation leader who was obliged to step down. Okay, thanks very much indeed.
I believe you've agreed to answer a couple of questions quickly. I have. Very happy to take questions. And I just thought that you might like this image that comes from a South African cartoonist, because this is taken from a South African newspaper last November, where it has Zuma looking at himself in the mirror, and does he see Robert Mugabe? In other words, was this ready for him? And the answer is, of course, yes, it was. How very prescient, I thought. One of our historians in African history would like to just sort of chair your Q&A, if that's all right.
Sure.
Yes, brilliant.
So where do you want me to sit?
You can take a seat over here if you like. Thank you.
Okay.
So does anyone have any questions? Guy?
Do you think there'll be or sort of what reconfiguration of groundwork political activity do you think there'll be, whether that's a rise in an opposition party getting popularity?
Great question.
The next stage as well?
Okay, sorry, is the microphone still working?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, very, very interesting question. And I think I'm going to answer that in three ways. First of which is that when I talked about the crisis over Robert Mugabe's, the future leadership of Zimbabwe was going on within ZANU-PF, it was principally because the opposition was marginalized from the July 2013 election. And it's been something of an omnishambles. There are now, I think it's up to 40 registered political parties in Zimbabwe. Of those, I think there are 5 that have any degree of a national profile. But with the death of Morgan Tsvangirai, who was an extraordinarily brave man and who genuinely had a national profile, MDC is now challenged by, again, warring factions. Between Nelson Chamisa, who has indicated that he would go into a government of all talents, and Thoka Nkupe, who is from Matabeleland, who is adopting a much sterner oppositional line. Okay, so the opposition don't have, should we say, unity of purpose and unity of focus. They are divided in their lack of strategy. They are starved of funds. But also, ZANU-PF is ahead of the game. They have been sending out political commissars into the areas to start to make preparations for the election months ago. So certainly before Christmas. So in other words, their grassroots organization is ahead of MDC's. So their visibility is there in the rural areas, which already were, it could be said, their natural, well, not natural constituency, that's the wrong phrase, but that was the bedrock of their support, was in the rural areas. So I'm afraid there are those who are saying in the opposition that although we go forward for free and fair elections, they don't actually anticipate that these elections will necessarily be violent, because ZANU-PF is in a strong position. The army doesn't need to step in and use violence to deliver the election result, because the opposition is so disorganized. There are those in the opposition saying we should really look to 2023. Does that answer? Yeah. Okay. There is the debate about the biometric voter registration, because elections are stolen months, if not years ahead of time. It's never, necessarily around the events on polling day. And this whole question, all sides accept they need to have a much more reliable voters' roll. This is important for any national election. It's also important for local elections. But there have been, debates about how reliable is the biometric voter information they're gathering, very slow processing, the lack of resources, lack of officials to do it, lack of training. So they're already behind schedule. But it'll be an improvement on what they've had before. But there's also debate about the reliability of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, because its head had to step down. I think there was a conflict of interest there. She's a political figure.
Yep.
I've got a couple of questions, actually. So my first one is about the disgruntled liberation fighters.
Mm-hmm.
I think the current president will deal with those. So all right.
Okay, yeah. I was very interested by the appointments that Mnangagwa made when he became president, because I thought that really shows where you need to do your political paybacks. I made reference to the war veterans and led by Chris Muchangwa, and Chris Muchangwa hoped that he would be made foreign minister, and he's actually been appointed a special advisor to the president. It's no accident, I think, that SB Moyo, he who of announcing the non-coup on television, he's been made the foreign minister. In other words, there has been a real interjection of the army into political affairs. One of the reasons I think that the older generation, the Team Lacoste and their allies in the security services, were so disgruntled by the behaviour, attitudes and threat to their own vested interests that came from the G40 group and political representation was precisely because they had announced that they were going to roll back the military budget. Now, that was going to hit them hard, in their own vested interests. So this was a changing of the guard in the upper echelons, if you like, and of particular political linkages between ZANU-PF leadership and sections of the security forces. The G40 cabal had different links within CIO and the police, and in fact it's been reported that 400 people have been taken into custody who were Mugabe loyalists. So, if you like, the dissident element is still being surveyed and controlled by elements of the military, by the security structures. In terms of other dissidents, the membership of the War Veterans Association, they are looking to delivery for their day-to-day material interests. So this is why the new government, it has to deliver, because they know that they're facing the judgment of the people at the polls. Does that answer your question? But in terms of what's going on in Matabeleland, that is really fraught, but that's an MDC stronghold down there. So I would expect that they will continue to return MDC MPs.
And then my second question was about what the ZANU-PF would look like post Graceful Mugabe.
What ZANU-PF will look like? Yes, with the departure of Graceful Mugabe from the political scene, they've lost a lightning rod, a scapegoat, certainly. But they have, if you like, reasserted their ideological narrative. There is certainly a political attitude, a conviction of an entitlement to govern. That is indelible, that, in other words, that national liberation should remain in the hands of the national liberation movement. And this is what constitutes, should we say, Zimbabwe's independence. Any retreat from that, any political recalibration, any loss to an alternative political party was seen as counter-revolutionary. It was regressive. So Grace Mugabe, in a way, her removal from the scene is a relief, and it's a reassertion of a national liberation narrative that she was complicating, without a doubt. In terms of actually what this then says for ZANU-PF moving forward, it remains the claimed party of the revolution, but it also it's moving more towards also, how to say, practices of neoliberalism, although Mnangagwa doesn't have the possibility of rampant deregulation for fear of what this will do then to the remaining Zimbabwe productive forces in manufacturing, which has been severely, severely battered. A real neoliberal economic strategy would also mean dramatically cutting not simply the civil service budget, which comprised 2/3 of annual expenditure, but it would also mean cutting the allocation of the military budget, and that he can't afford to do, because the military was expanded dramatically. Now, we all know from what happened when the coalition of the willing and the Americans particularly, of course, decided to disband the Iraqi army after the invasion of Iraq. Now, that is not a political risk that Mnangagwa can take. In other words, to see a dramatic diminution, a dramatic reduction of the size of the security forces. Because it will hit not just the stability of the regime, but it's also, it directly hits people's jobs and their families that are dependent on those jobs. So it's the wider ramifications of that.
Yep.
What do you think will happen regarding land reform?
Interesting question, that. Mnangagwa's speech that he gave underlined that land reform was irreversible. But he also said that there would be compensation paid for land that was taken. Now, that, of course, immediately raised the debate, well, where was he going to get the money from for that? Because, of course, that had been the principal source of the breakdown of relations between Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe's rule and the British government. So there is an acceptance that there has to be a degree of compensation, but at what level, that I don't know. That some 200 cases have been settled, but I believe as many as 2,000 remain outstanding. The process has been going, but it has been going very, very slowly. There is an acceptance that there has to be a land audit, that there has to be, should we say, reassertion of ownership, of title, but there is also, with that land audit, there's a determination that there shouldn't be there should be one family, one farm. And of course, that, because there was such rampant corruption with the political elite in the land seizures and a very narrow circle of people who had multiple farms. So there is an awareness that this needs to be addressed. But on this issue of corruption, again, Mnangagwa is he's on thin ice, because he's, yes, one of Zimbabwe's leading businessmen, but he has been directly implicated into extensive corrupt practices. It's, of course, widely known of the extent to which that the army particularly benefited from the discovery of alluvial diamonds in the Maranchi field, and that they were able to essentially strip those assets, none of which, a very, very small portion of which actually accrued to the exchequer. And I mean, these were billions of dollars that leached out of the country and should have had gone to the public finances.
How do you see China's impact and significance in Southern Africa?
Whoa. I think I always say this, it's complicated. It's good in parts. It's very, very bad in others. Where is it good? In that there is a wish for, Chinese offers at beneficial rates, although these are still, hard-driven deals, for construction of infrastructure, which is needed, for preferential loans, again needed. But the downside of this is the way in which Chinese infrastructure is built is to import the labor. The money spent is socially thin. It remains very much concentrated. It isn't dispersed into the wider economy in terms of contracts that are given to local businesses, and it certainly isn't fed out into, say, food vendors or accommodation or anything like that. There's also considerable debate about the quality of the infrastructure that they've built, and also again, an alienation of of the nation's wealth. So is this neo-colonialism another version of imperialism under another name? I was talking to a European businessman who's lived in Zimbabwe for about 30 years. He felt that on balance it was good, but he was hoping for Zimbabwe's robust re-engagement with international investors, with foreign direct investment, and for welcoming in other investors, precisely so that there shouldn't be wholesale loss to China, and that China wouldn't, in fact, become, if you like, the monopsony, the sole buyer, and dominate the Zimbabwean economy to an extraordinary degree. And he really felt that the potential was there. So, good in parts. Does that answer it? But I also think that there is an assumption or an image of China sweeping in and hoovering up. There are multiple Chinese players that are involved. Deborah Brautigan has written about this, the Dragon's Gift. She writes very, very clearly and in a very authoritative way about the multi-level engagement of China in Africa. And it also means it does require robust institutions, parliamentary oversight to ensure whatever contracts are struck abide by local regulations in the national interest, that there is, shall we say, oversight and assessment of how appropriate this is. So in those terms, if there's a robust regulatory environment in place, why not? But it's how robust is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Thinking about Mugabe as a man who stayed in power too long, do you believe that that's a role he was always likely to fill, given his beliefs about his own abilities? Or is this a position that he kind of was pushed into, grew into, after the Unilateral Declaration of Independence and his becoming a kind of guerrilla leader? Did that push him towards that kind of strong man?
Now, the interesting thing there is that Mugabe was never the great liberation fighter leader moving into the position, say, of I'm just trying to think, of Samora Machel. He was always a politician. He was the leader of the political movement. And it was also a collegiate structure. I mean, it's no accident that, the upper echelons of ZANU-PF are referred to as the Politburo, a collective leadership. But he certainly cultivated, from the days of the revolution, the cult of Mugabe. He certainly liked power. I've used quotes of that in the book of liberation fighters who initially endorsed him and then came to see that as a disastrous mistake. So I think that there was a complex process by which he believed himself certainly to have the qualities of leadership. He was a very adept political operator, but also he came to believe in the justice and his superior qualities. And when at points of crisis, he would present himself as the solution for ZANU-PF's problems, and people would believe him. Lord Carrington certainly commented that when he was a leader who, when he felt that he was in a stable position, he was not under threat, he could be extremely magnanimous and generous, a very charming man with a very interesting sense of humor, extremely well read, but when under pressure, that brought out a vicious, vindictive, ruthless side to his nature. Again, a complicated character, and a multifaceted one. And certainly practices of power became ingrained, and habits of power became comfortable and expected. But also, with this ideological attitude of the necessity of his variation of Afro-nationalism, and it was a permutation of socialism and African transformation in a post-colonial revolutionary moment. Professor Sabelo Gacheni Ndlovu writes very cogently about this. This question of a particular ideological variation manifest in Zimbabwe and typified by Robert Mugabe himself, because he really did come to typify the state to an extraordinary degree. I don't think he was ever going to go quietly. I did think that he might die in his bed. No, I mean, the Mugabe, shall we say, health watchers, I mean, there was an industry in itself of speculations, had he died? You know, there was yet another dash to Dubai. Well, I mean, was that because, you know, he'd had a heart attack and this, and, you know, they would speculate madly on social media, and then he'd pop up again and say, basically, rumours of my death have been grossly exaggerated. He said that, you know, he would rule until kingdom come and beyond. So, I mean, there was a certain ghoulish delight in defying, should we say, the doommongers who were predicting his demise. I think he became convinced of the necessity of his longevity in power.
Yep.
And how do you think that Mugabe, upon his death, will be seen domestically and internationally? How do you think he'll be viewed?
Okay, and I shouldn't say I've already written his obituary, but this question of legacy, again, many sides to it. He will be seen as a liberation leader who led his country to independence, who restored land to his people, who gave them back a sense of pride, who also was popular and admired among many sections across southern Africa for what was seen to be thumbing his nose at the West. This was an assertion of a Zimbabwean national confidence against the former imperial oppressor. If you like, it was tilting the scales of power and reasserting sovereignty and entitlement, that voice in the international community. And he certainly did that. And Zimbabweans took pride, and other Africans took pride in doing that. Others would say that he was responsible for gross human rights abuses against fellow political fighters in Mozambique, that he was responsible for the atrocities in Matabeleland that happened on his watch, and that certainly, if not by his direct order, that he was aware of it. So the degree of complicity and collusion, it suited a political purpose. He told Emmerson Mnangagwa to go down there and sort it out, even if he claimed that, you know, he had not issued a direct order. The instruction was resolve the issue. He was respected in the Commonwealth. He was respected in the non-aligned movement. He was seen as a leading African figure, and he was. I don't want to take in any way that away from him. He was also, it could be said, on his watch, the Zimbabwean economy went into meltdown. Again, gross human rights abuses. There was the deindustrialization of his country, which had been economically the second most diversified economy in southern Africa. It led to capital flight, human capital flight, the scattering of Zimbabweans, the breakup of families. The Zimbabwean diaspora, 500,000 strong in this country, in Australia, in Canada, 3 million Zimbabweans working in South Africa in many, far too many, in very precarious situations. To an informalization of his economy, to a national crisis, complicated legacy. He was all of those things. He was not a simple monster by any means. He was a multifaceted, complex man. As a leader, he remains a complex man. People change. Certain attributes become embedded. Other facets of their character may be eclipsed. They may revert to previous patterns of behavior learned, formed in childhood, in early youth. People can become transformed as they go through their life. He was certainly, he changed his country, and it changed with him, for good and ill.
Okay, well, I'd just like to thank our speaker again for this evening. And yeah, that's the end. So we have a wine reception afterwards, so feel free to help yourselves to that. And yeah, that's it.